All right. I think that's long enough. It's 2:02 Eastern time. So thank you so much for joining us today for Better Stories, Better Language, a new voice for philanthropy. That is our fancy way of saying we have found out some cool things we want to share with you and are really, really excited that so many of you are joining us today. My name is Nicole Bronson. I am the Vice President of Communications and Content at the Council on Foundations. And we will have an esteemed panel here for you today. We are, however, going to start out, like the scientists we are, with a brief poll. So if you could just take a few minutes for a very short survey. It's mostly multiple choice, and we estimate that it will take us about 4 or 5 minutes. We're really interested in understanding how you use narrative and storytelling in your work, what the challenges and opportunities are, and obviously, the ability to come back to you later after this project is complete to see if anything's changed. So please use either the URL there, which is now in the chat, or the QR code, and just take a few minutes to do the survey for us, and that way we'll have some data to start. And I'm sure folks will come in late and wonder what is going on. We're just sitting here looking at each other. All right, I see some new folks in here. Just want to tell you what's going on. Before we get started, we are taking a short survey, both to help us understand how this work can help you and what the challenges are, and as actually part of the work to understand how you're using stories and narratives, and hoping that we can come back to you in 6 months or a year and say, hey, has this changed? Has this helped? So just a couple more minutes, and then we will get started with the presentation. All righty. We're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to finish up if you need to. Take your time, keep it open, finish it, later after this. We're going to go ahead and get started sharing what we found with you. So I want to explain kind of how this all came about. We've started to chat with some of you at conferences and just kind of in passing about this work. And one of the things that I always hear is, well, where did this all get started? And I think in short, the sort of why this, why now is, as you may all sort of, you may feel similarly to how I feel, philanthropy on its face seems like a very feel-good story. And I think a lot of us are surprised when we hear things that are not so forgiving or positive about philanthropy. So one of the things that we were interested in as we, work in this period of 24-hour access to information and news and everybody's opinions at all times. And also, I think, some very valid questions about power and wealth and how that's concentrated in philanthropy, and really what philanthropy's role is in society. We were really interested in looking at what this actually looks like. So is it true that people feel X way or Y way? And really, I want to stress that this is obviously a communications effort, but it's not just a PR problem. These feelings about philanthropy, narratives that are sort of underpinning them, have implications for policy, for how we do our work. We've seen that in many ways. I don't have to name any names right now, but we've seen that on the Hill. So it's really important that we make sure people understand how we do our work and why. So we were really interested in digging into this. And before I get too far, I just want to acknowledge a couple of our funders for this work who can tell us a little bit more about why they were interested in this work. We really have tried to pull a cross-section of philanthropy together on this, not just in funding, but also in who's working on it and who has input for us. So I would love to welcome Daphne Moore, who is the Director of Communications at the Walton Family Foundation, just to talk to us for a minute about why this was really important for her work and the value that she sees. So Daphne, it looks like you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted, but I
There we
think
go.
I still have the controls to my video.
Oh, my apologies.
No worries.
I will promote you, but go
Thank you.
ahead.
Thank you. Love to be promoted. And thank you, Nicole. Always good to be together. And I'll just keep talking until video comes on, unless I'm able to do it.
I think you should be.
There I am. Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you, Nicole, for pulling this together and really for your leadership on this topic, you and Kathleen both. And it is always wonderful to be seated, even if virtually, next to my friend Michelle Moore with the Ford Foundation. And, we are two pretty different foundations, but, what we both understand is really the unique role that philanthropy and foundations can play in our society, as well as our need as philanthropy and foundations to have that trust in our sector. And so what excites me about this project is really the opportunity to lift up the conversation about the unique role of philanthropy in our society and working across sectors, because our problems are they're too big and too interconnected really for one sector to have all the solutions, not business, not government and not philanthropy, but we know that we each bring something unique and have a unique value proposition. I was reflecting, there was a week not too long ago where in news coverage, our foundation was referred to in one outlet as the far right leaning and another as far left. The truth is really neither. And so if we can really get this conversation back to the role that philanthropy plays in solving just some of the biggest problems of our time, philanthropy can be bold, not just about solutions, but about what's possible. We can be inclusive, we can bring new voices to help solve old problems. And, again, we can bring people together, but we can also be really agile. And we've seen that here in recent years, how philanthropy can really be first to respond in certain situations. So I think there's just all sorts of great things that we do as a sector, and really want to shine a light on that. So with that, I can pass it back to you, Nicole, or to Michelle.
Let's let Michelle say a few words. We've been having some technical difficulties, but here we are.
Here we are. It's a Friday. These things happen. But no, thank you so much, Daphne, and you're such a great partner with us and so many of my colleagues. And it's just wonderful to be here and just to talk about, how we really articulate our stories more effectively, to be aware of kind of our position of power relative to our grantees and the work that we do. And the biggest context for us probably particularly in the last 18 months, has been that, polarization and our political landscape has changed. It's changed significantly. And how philanthropy shows up is more important than ever. And it's the stories we tell and the ways in which we tell them that are critical. So we just have to be more attuned to our own language and ensuring that we really create more connective tissue between our policymakers and those that we have to talk to oftentimes in government and engage with in ways that we haven't had to before. And it's just, part of the process of being smart organizations, supporting those both on the left and frankly on the right in the ways in which we do our work, whether it be in social justice or healthcare or a variety of things that we support, and doing so in a way that's really accessible and that we're not speaking both in our own heads, which can be formal and stilted and not connected because not everyone understands and knows our work. But the importance of it is more relevant than ever today because the broad spectrum of individuals that we have to speak to about our sector is continuing to evolve and spread, and that we can't be sort of isolationists within our own sector speaking to one another, but that the environment in the landscape in which we operate today is so much more complex. And so driven by whether it be, as we all know, social media, earned media, and all these other places, that if we're not telling our own story, then that vacuum is being filled by the stories of others. And we don't want to do that as communications professionals. So I think it's a great opportunity today to kind of clarify how we can do this work so much better and make sure that we're connected in a way that really shares the great work that we do in philanthropy in a really smart and sophisticated way. So again, thank you to the council for pulling this information together and really sharing what we think is going to be a continually important project and journey that we take as a philanthropy.
Thank you so much, both of you, so much, both for your support, obviously, but also just to speak to a little bit of what's going on here. I think, one of the things we've heard so far is that a lot of this resonates with folks, but it still feels kind of abstract. So we're going to dig in. To that end, the first step really in this project, which we see as an ongoing one, was really to do that scan, to say, what is the conversation? What are the narratives about philanthropy, at least in our nation? We know there's a more global conversation too, but philanthropy in America is certainly an institution unlike any other globally. And so this landscape scan we did last fall, and it encompasses thousands of pages of news coverage, of op-eds and other random opinions, national polling. It is certainly not comprehensive and including everything that was ever written about philanthropy, but we think that it is a true picture of the conversation right now, which is to say, I would say the past five years or so. So we are going to take you through today some of the findings and also some of the potential steps we can take together now to try to address some of the things that we found. So I will turn it over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you. It's really exciting to be able to do this work and to do this deep dive and to share some early insights, and along with that, an invitation for us to learn as a sector together about how to do better work. And so when I came across this quote from Kamal Sinclair, when I heard her share this at a conference last year, I was really moved by this description of narrative. A single story is like a star. There are billions in the universe, and each one is a valuable part of our shared reality. A narrative is the way in which we imagine the connections between those stars and draw a constellation to make meaning and find patterns. And I love this. I'd never seen narrative explained in exactly this way, but the metaphor was so powerful and really meaningful. But then as I started to reflect on the work that we're doing together and this massive scan that we did of these thousands of pages of documents, something became very clear, which is our sector, the philanthropic sector, faces a narrative vacuum. So what does that mean, that we have a narrative vacuum? It's not that we're not telling stories. It's that the stories that we're telling tend to be built around single characters. They're not necessarily including systems and people in foundations as characters in those stories. They might reinforce power dynamics that are centering philanthropy. They might not be including the people who are doing the work, whether it's the people that foundations are supporting or the people within foundations. And so that means that the sector isn't collectively reinforcing the narratives about how it works. So across America and from a wide range of perspectives, there is this lack of understanding of philanthropy, a lack of a shared identity that comes through a narrative. And therefore, we're not really defining the role of philanthropy for Americans. So foundations are for sure telling stories about their funding and the difference that it makes, but that peek behind the curtain isn't happening. And the polling shows that transparency around data doesn't necessarily add up to understanding. And so if we're offering transparency around the data and what foundations are investing in, but not how foundation staff and leaders are making decisions or doing their work or working with communities, the data doesn't necessarily add up to the transparency that could lead to greater understanding. So Michelle mentioned this need for that connective tissue. We don't have that connective tissue among the stories that the sector is telling. So it does leave others to make their own connections. We create a narrative vacuum that is available for others to fill with their own understanding, their own ideas, or even their own agendas. But I think what's most important about that is that the real stories of how change happens aren't told in a way that helps others learn and gain inspiration and make that change happen over and over again. So in the documents that we reviewed, we discovered that don't always have great language habits. We saw a lot of metaphors used to describe the work of foundations that come from other sectors that we don't actually relate to. So metaphors are great. I love metaphors as a super effective communication tool. But in our sector, we tend to use a lot of sports and military and financial metaphors, or that unintentionally invoke violence. And I think we are collectively in a place where we know it's more important every day to avoid normalizing language that is built around competition and scarcity and violence. But it's also true that when we're using those metaphors, we don't actually mean what we say. These metaphors are not apt descriptions of how we do our work or how we work with communities. And we didn't see a common language that was specific to the field of philanthropy. And because the sector borrows its metaphors from other fields, there may be this sort of reinforcement that we are more similar to other sectors rather than unique in the contributions and in the difference that we make. So one of the things that we really saw as sort of a void in the language was language about how foundations make decisions and how staff in foundations interact with the problems that foundations set out to solve in partnership with community. Nor was there a lot of language necessarily about how people closest to problems are identifying solutions and working to solve them. So looking at better stories and better language may feel like kind of a narrow lens for solving a really complex problem that Nicole described. But we also see a lot of space for experimentation. Story and metaphor do more to communicate meaning than any other tool we have, and they represent the best paths forward for shifting this conversation. We also go into this work with a lot of hope and a belief that there's really great work out there that is a great example of how to do this well. And we are looking forward to examining that work and celebrating it and holding it up and looking at its potential to begin to build that transparency and trust that we need. So Erin, do you want to take us through the some of the stories that we saw and the deep narratives that we saw?
Absolutely. And so to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to stories, pun intended, we want to understand, why should we look at stories and narratives and language? Well, this quote from Heather McGhee really makes it clear. Everything that we believe comes from a story that we've been told. Stories help us make sense of the world. And the science behind stories is that they help us improve our comprehension. They increase our self-efficacy through demonstration. They influence real-world beliefs, and they are successful at persuading otherwise resistant audiences. They really help us contextualize data. Basically, they provide clarity. And the building blocks of these stories are the language that we choose. Knowing that everything that we believe comes from these stories, the words in these stories become deeply tied to the beliefs that we have in the world. So, kind of relying on some of the research from Narrative Initiative, we have this sort of taxonomy of narratives. Stories are these pieces that build up into narratives. And like Anne mentioned before, these are the connections that we build between stories. They're the central themes and the lessons that we learn. And then those build up bigger into deep narratives. Deep narratives are the age-old collections of ideas, values, and worldviews that get at how we make sense of our relationships to ourselves, others, and the broader world. And so as we were diving into these thousands of pages of documents, we tried to identify what were the stories that were being told, what sort of lessons were being communicated, and what sort of worldviews were showing up, those deep narratives. And we identified three that seemed to pop up pretty frequently. And those are a distrust of wealth, an unease with private funds solving public problems, and a single hero saves the day. Now, these are the three harmful narratives that we really saw. And as we go through them, you'll see that there's a bit of an overlap between them, and we'll try our best to identify the differences. But the benefit of them overlapping is that the solutions and the strategies we use to displace these harmful narratives also overlap. So let's dive in. Up first, we have the distrust in wealth narratives. Now, the central theme in these are that wealth begets power, and they really emphasize this distance between people who are rich, the people that work for the people who are rich, and people who are not wealthy. And so there are four narratives that really fit into this distrust of wealth. The first is the New Gilded Age. You may have heard the NPR Throughline podcast. That one really gives a good overview of what this narrative is. It really focuses in on history, what that era of philanthropy was back at the turn of the 20th century. Had to do that math in my head. But really focuses in on that history and this idea that charity is an embellishment to a foundation or a philanthropist. The second one is philanthropy keeps the rich rich. Now, stories in this narrative really focus in on the tax benefits and all the procedures that come with endowments. And we saw that this was a particularly effective one because in a 2020 Ipsos poll, they found that as people learned more about the tax rules surrounding foundations and donor advised funds, the less they liked those institutions. The third narrative we saw was who wields power. Now, this one focuses more on the layers that put philanthropy at the top, nonprofits in the middle, and the communities that are impacted at the bottom. And a lot of the language that's used in there focuses in on oversight or bigfooting, where philanthropy comes in and tries to take the spotlight or undermines nonprofits. And that's really the conflict that appears in those stories. And last, we have tainted money that really focuses in on where the money is from and who donates it as a sort of dirty money source. And the conflict focuses around rejecting that money. And so how can we displace narratives about distrust? We really need to focus in on transparency, like Anne was mentioning before. And this is not just talking about data or showing your 990 or finding the perfect spokesperson. It's really about emphasizing partnership and providing specific stories about the community and what your funding does. So some things that we can do now, we can tell transparent and clear specific stories, center the community in your stories with real people interacting, and include people within your foundation in the story. If you're talking about the work that you're doing in your foundation, talk about the day-to-day work and how that's relating to the community and getting things done. Up next, we have an unease with private funds solving public issues. So this boardroom kind of gives a good example of what this means. It's a boardroom of people making a decision that impacts millions of people. And that's the sort of connective tissue between these harmful narratives in this section. And so they emphasize power, particularly in relationship with the government or governing decisions. And the two narratives that really popped up in this space were threatening democracy and filling the gap. So threatening democracy is the more insidious one. It talks about, it focuses on elites making decisions for society and working outside or around democracy. A quote from that Gilded Age podcast really makes this very clear. You can't vote out a foundation. The second narrative is filling the gap. And this is where the unease comes from a lack of clarity about where government ends and where philanthropy starts. And also this idea that we might be too reliant on philanthropy. And so to challenge these, or not challenge, but to displace these narratives, we really should be focusing in on clarity, being very clear about what the role foundations and philanthropy takes in a larger change-making community. And so the way we can displace this is through clear language, centering communities again, and the decisions that they are making to drive change, and then focus in on your role as a partner within the community rather than at the helm. Last, we have a single hero saves the day. If you can't tell, I really like Batman, and his story really fits this. It's this idea that someone with money comes in to save the day. It's a magical story that skips straight to the resolution. It doesn't talk about the systems that are in place or the community that takes action to make things happen. These stories really rely on individualism. They lack that system. And unfortunately, they frequently rely on stigmatizing language and stereotyping. And research shows that when we use stigmatizing language or stereotyping language, we actually can cause more harm by making policy solutions that would actually solve the problem less appealing to a more general audience. And so two types of narratives really fall into this space. The savior narratives, which are stories that center a foundation or a donor and overemphasizes the role of philanthropy in solving problems. And then the other one is My Life Was Transformed. Now, the My Life Was Transformed narrative puts an impacted person at the center, but it frequently uses stigmatizing or extractive language and really puts people in a context that does not provide power. This is where a lot of the bootstrapping language appears. And it doesn't really take into account how communities can really work together to solve issues. So We can displace these narratives, we think, with telling a system story or a story of collective action. So in this space, it's important to recognize that we frequently rely on single person protagonist stories, but research is showing from frameworks that systems thinking is on the rise. So we can really trust that our actors and our audiences can really resonate with a community-based system story. So take a risk, tell those stories, and question the metaphors and the phrases that you're using to describe the communities that you work with. And you should also avoid telling the press release story, which is the very boring story of, we gave this money to this nonprofit to do X, Y, and Z. Instead, talk about the work that they're actually doing, what the community is doing, and how you're partnering with them. And last, show how you make decisions in partnerships with community. So as a recap, we have these distrust narratives, the unease ones, and then the single hero saves the day. And like I said before, the solutions overlap. And those are use transparency, speak with clarity, and talk about systems and collective action. And now I will pass it back to Anne to go through what we can start doing now.
Thanks, Aaron. So we realize that we've laid out some pretty complex challenges that are deeply associated with how we do business and how we have historically told our stories, and even how our teams are designed to tell these stories, and that we're asking you to do some different things. So some of the things that we want to invite you to experiment with, and if you're doing these things already, we want to hear about it, is starting with telling those better stories, really thinking like, what kinds of stories will, what kinds of accurate and fascinating stories can we tell about real people, the people who are affected, the people who are making decisions and why they're making those decisions, the people who need help, making room for tension and uncertainty and messiness, and including some of the parts of the story that may seem boring to you, but will help others understand what the work actually looks like. Include systems in those stories and the choices that brought those systems into place, and show how relationships and trust and people working together help to solve the problem. We also want to encourage you to describe what funding actually supports in a specific granular way. Which bills get paid with the funds that foundations are providing? Does grant funding make it possible for people to get paid for work that couldn't be done in other ways? And really think about including why statements that are meaningful and connect to moral values and shared identity. As you think about the language that you're using, we want to encourage you to really interrogate your metaphors. Just in doing this work, we've caught ourselves many, many times using the very metaphors that we called out here, because it's so habitual. It's such a natural part. Try and put together a slide deck without using the phrase bullet points. But it brings to mind how much violence is normalized as how we talk every day. So notice that and look at where you're coming up with alternatives that may make more sense and be more accurate. And one of the ones to watch out for are some of the hierarchical metaphors that creep in. We hear a lot of phrases like people on the ground rather than people who are closest to the problem. A lot of times too, in our field, each of us has specific content expertise associated with the work that we do. And that content expertise reflects itself in coded phrases that have a lot of baggage and are increasingly becoming politicized, but may not be increasing transparency or understanding. And it's such a small thing, but one of the things that we saw a lot of is passive voice. And none of us really like passive voice to begin with. We're trained not to do it in journalism school. But here, it's a moral question, because when you're using passive voice, you're obscuring who is actually taking the action. So these are some of the things that we want to experiment with, and we want to encourage you to experiment with. But we also want to acknowledge that we are on the very beginning of a very long project. And on the end of this at the end of this work, we will have far more specific recommendations that are really coming from the best of the work that you all are already doing.
Yes, so on that note, hey everybody, I'm Jack. I am a political economist who studies comms. So I'm super excited by the research that's going to come out of this project, and that's already been done. But we just saw a lot of the harmful narratives that Aaron and the team shared with us. But what we want to learn from our future research is to dive deeper into what will work better in terms of messages and story that foundations can use going forward, especially some of the things Anne was just mentioning. So we have a multi-stage approach coming up, including collecting your views today. Thank you to everybody who already submitted the survey. And if you have time after, we'd love for you to finish that survey when you get a chance. So we'll drop it into the chat one more time in case you joined late. And then we're also going to send out smaller surveys to the field to collect even more data from the field to really understand what's happening with stories and narratives. Then, really excitingly, we'll launch a national survey as well, representative of Americans, to unearth views held of the philanthropy sector with a particular focus on psychographics, such as worldviews, moral values, and trusted institutions, to understand what narratives are pervasive and what different kinds of story messages can shift views that these different groups view towards the role of philanthropy. And we're really excited about the psychographic element because we haven't seen many surveys at all that tap into that. And as Anne was mentioning, we're really curious about testing transparency and trust, either trust in institutions, trust in the institution of philanthropy, and how transparency might work or not work through various mechanisms that it's being used. Then, as Nicole was mentioning, we see this as a longer stage project. We're going to follow up and poll the sector some more later on. Maybe even, we're not sure how many years this will last, but we hope to get some mid-tier surveys. And then maybe a year or more later, we'll even see where things are at. So excited for the long-term research project that this is. Back to you, Nicole.
All right. Thanks, everybody, so much. I have read and helped write the report. I have heard this so many times, and every single time I'm just blown away by these narratives, and to your point, Anne, the language that is so ingrained. It's crazy. So as Jack just mentioned, we are just at the beginning of this process. We are moving into actual message testing, trying to figure out what can we recommend for you, what tools can we bring to the field so we can do a better job of telling our stories. To that end, though, we do need your help. This is one of the things, if you were at Frank, you heard us say, and I'll be talking at a couple different conferences this year, I hope, to say the same thing. If you have examples of the ways that you're doing this well, the ways that you're centering people closest to the problem, and using new language that's not sports or military or some way competitive, if there are metaphors that work. We were talking about this, lifting people up, or bringing people to the table, which again has a power dynamic to it that's not the best for us. So we would really love to hear from you. I'm putting my personal council email address here because I really want to hear from you. If you have ideas or stories, if you've heard other people speak on this, or you've seen it on their website. We are, like I said, we're just sort of beginning, and this everything that you share with us will help us to understand both the field and the ways that we can take bright spots into testing and figure out what really works for all of us. That said, we are going to open it up for questions now. And my email again is in the chat as well. And I'll share it again at the end of the presentation, but we would love to hear your questions. I will just go through some of the ones we've gotten in the Q&A. Can you give an example, story example of day-to-day work for reference? so I'll take this one. It was funny. I can't remember, and I'm sorry, I need to find it. I can't remember who I saw this from, but I was doing some story work 6 months ago or so for our member week, and I came across a foundation where they had actually talked about, they had a blog post that explained their sort of I don't want to call it a reckoning. I think that's kind of a dramatic way to describe this, but their journey through DEI, and in particular the way that the way that they wanted to walk the walk better in their funding. And then they had actual sort of program officers describe the meetings that they had, the processes that they went through to figure out how to do better. And then they actually had some examples, and then we funded this and this happened. And so it was, to Anne's point, it was not, hey, 5 million went to X foundation to do Y. It was, these people had this journey, made these decisions. Here's what it looks like. And now, the work is happening, and that's where we need to focus our attention. I will find it so that I can come back with a specific answer. I'm sorry, but, even blog posts, I see this a lot on foundation websites, blog posts that tell the story of a grantee, for example, but they may be written by a program officer, but the program officer's voice isn't in there, right? It's just, I'm just the sort of loudspeaker to tell this story. And wouldn't it be interesting to know, how did you meet that grantee? How did you come to understand the effect of their work? I can tell you all about going to a farm in New Jersey and, with kids who don't know what green beans look like on the bush. And that was an amazing experience for me, to sort of see the work. And I think telling the story in that way, as opposed to, this farm did X numbers of pounds and they, distributed to these many people. It's sort of like, let me show you Billy, right? Who's like, what is that? And, oh, I can eat this. And wow, this is delicious, right? So just, again, specific, very sort of personal, and really focusing on the people and not the money, because the money is sort of where we get all of our headlines these days. So I hope I sort of answered that question. This one I am going to give to Anne, from Tony. What were you seeing about the increasingly interrelated use of money for political and charitable ends? Dark money, for example, there's this argument used by both political parties now to attack the other. So we talked a little bit about this, Anne, about how there's also confusion about that. Can you say more about what you saw in the landscape scan?
Yeah, I mean, it's very present. And I think is a theme that's really thoughtfully discussed in that Throughline episode that Erin mentioned, as this idea that there's this whole system of resources that is operating outside of democracy. And we're not seeing it from one particular political perspective. It's coming from lots of different directions. So I think that this is something that that we are deeply, deeply cognizant of. And Erin, you saw it in the deep, you flagged it in the deep narratives as well.
Yes, it really popped up mostly in the threat to democracy narrative, that unease, because there was a lack of clarity. I think it's the most clear example of what happens when there is a narrative vacuum, because there's no common language or common thread that ties the sector together. It's really easy to say, oh, well, I have this very nice, easy, dark money narrative that I can put right here. And it's going to make sense to people. It's going to tap into some of those fears or disgust that we hear from other stories in our culture. And so it's just the perfect example of why we really need to be doing this sort of storytelling, to really make clear, this is what we're doing. It's not dark money. We are, I think both Michelle and Daphne pointed this out, we can take chances. We can work with communities in ways that the government can't right now, and then they can come in later. There are different stories we can tell here that really clarify what we do as a sector.
Yeah, and just to your point there, I think, the other thing about the dark money piece, right, is that these harmful narratives take hold, and then they start circulating on Capitol Hill, and you get proposals, legislative proposals, that don't actually number one, aren't helpful, right? Don't actually even address the problem as it is. But there's this narrative that's out there that, oh, dark money and oh, Soros this and oh, and it's just, it becomes so hard to even know where philanthropy ends and dark money begins. And I think that's a really, really big issue right now. We get it with media requests, people asking us this. So we do really need to do a better job with that. So our next question is about stakeholders, city employees, donors, community members. How do you deal with folks or even your own staff who don't respond well to non-traditional ways of communicating? I am going to interpret a little bit here to say non-traditional meaning the press release, the self-aggrandizing statements about how we're helping all these communities. I want to also maybe push a little further and say, we all know, we all come from organizations where we're people, we have egos, and some of that creeps in too, right? So we want to see our names out there. We want the organization to have a high profile. So that's a balancing act. I don't know, Anne or Aaron, if you have anything to add about how we can at least start these conversations where we can move folks from focusing on, the traditional to what really works.
For sure. I have a lot of thoughts about that. And I think anybody who's worked in communications has found themselves in this position where they have a pretty good sense of what the strategy should be and how to execute that strategy. But the hardest part of your job can be building support for that approach within your organization, and not even just within leadership, across everybody in the organization who needs to be part of making that happen. We created this tool that we call the Back of the Envelope Guide to Strategy. It's a 4-question guide, and my colleague Annie and I wrote this up for Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it's a good tool for just internalizing communication, but I find it most useful when I have that person ducking into my office to tell me that we need to organize a 5K to raise awareness of XYZ problem. So I'll pull out my 4 questions and ask them, well, what do we actually want to be true that isn't true right now? And who has to change their behavior or take an action for that to happen? And what would they believe if they were doing that? And where is their attention now? And going through those questions together creates an opportunity to build the communications capacity of the people around you, because in this work of making positive social change happen, every single person in an organization is a communicator. They may not necessarily embrace their role as a communicator, but it's really important to begin to build that expertise across your organization in a loving and useful way.
Thank you. And I just got a question about wanting to share this. Yes, please do share. We are going to post the video to our website, and the same page where you registered, it will be posted there. And obviously, as we do the research and develop the tools, we're going to come back to the field and share those as well. As Michelle and Daphne both said, we are not interested in holding this close to the chest here. We want everybody to do this. We want to speak as one field and really tell these stories in a not just effective, but a way that sounds nice and feels good and really builds the sense that philanthropy is a community. And we, just like the milk lobby or the wheat lobby, maybe not the best example, we should have some things that we agree on. Why is our work valuable? How can we sort of make sure that we're doing that all together? So we will share, definitely. And like I said, I'll put my email address in the chat again. I want to hear from you. Please just reach out anytime. I don't actually see any more questions, which seems just a little crazy. So I guess I will just say, if you have further questions, let me just put it in there. More about the goals. Sure. So Julian asks, can you say more about the goals of this project? Yes. So some of the goals are probably sound pie in the sky, but they are still goals. One is, again, that we as a sector recognize that we need to do a better job and actually sort of come together and figure out what are these narratives. We don't have a a campaign or a, kind of one of these uniting issues that sort of gets us all together in one room saying, okay, what are the messages? A lot of us we have the money, we have the power, right? So we're not used to coming together and saying, how can we, work with other foundations and figure out what the best voice is, or should you be saying this and I'm saying this because of where I am? Maybe I don't need to be on the front of the New York Times today because you're saying this, and we want to make sure we're really holding that up. So I think that's the first one, just to get together as a community and behave like a community so that we can make sure we're telling better stories and using that better language. The second goal, just to turn the lens a little bit this way, right? One of our goals as the project team is to be a resource. So we're as I said, we're pulling in support and input from all over the sector because we want to share back with the whole sector. This is not about left and right. This is not about community foundation versus private foundation versus corporate. This is about a whole field that has a common interest and should, at the very least, recognize that and share this information. So that's where we're really excited, is to be able to bring these tools back to you. And I think, just to state it again, I think the overarching goal is for us to see these better stories out in the world. I think back to, I came from kind of a health equity foundation stance. And so I am very aware of the way that the word equity has been used over the past 10 years or so. And it's just, if you had told me even 5 years ago that it would be out there in the way that it is now, I would never have believed you. So I think, we have an opportunity to see a shift in real time, to measure that shift and to try to understand, are we getting it right? And if not, how can we do better? Again, I see this, especially for the council, as an effort that it outlives this research project, right? It should continue as, we are coming together as a field. We are sharing resources. We are lifting each other up and lifting up our stories. That's a key part of my job. So that will not stop. I'll be quiet now. Anne or Aaron or Jack, did you want to say anything else about any of our goals? I get really excited.
I think you
All right.
perfectly encapsulated them.
Yeah, this is my favorite part of my job, so I could just talk about it all day. So we will leave it there. I see one last question. We'll take that one and then we'll go. We recently rolled out a new strategic plan, and I'm excited to use these tools within our plan of increasing a culture of belonging and philanthropy narratives. Oh, thank you. So not a question, just a yay. We like that. What resources do you recommend we use to introduce narrative change to others? That's a great question. And I know you flagged a couple of things. What else would we recommend for folks just to start to have this conversation?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of really great resources out there. The Narrative Initiative continually puts out really great resources and tools. They have a phenomenal newsletter that's a wonderful resource. We are, you may have noticed, big fans of storytellers like Heather McGee. I think she does, in her book, The Sum of Us, she does a phenomenal job of modeling this kind of storytelling where she's showing the decisions and choices that were made that created the systems that we're in many places trying to change. She builds those around real characters, but she doesn't build them around single heroes. So her book and her podcast are just fantastic examples of this. We've got a site called The Science of Story the Science of Story Building that really looks at the power of telling stories that are rooted in the best of what we know from science. And so we've got a 7-point framework that we put together that we can share with you. Aaron, Jack, what other resources might you add?
While you're thinking, I will just say all of these things we will package together and send to you. Everything that's been in the chat, don't worry about capturing it. We will make sure in the post-event email that has the video and also the resources that we recommend and all of the sort of next steps.
And I want to acknowledge that the fact that that's a short list is really representative of why we need to do this work. And one of the things that we're really hoping will come from this is the great examples from the work that you're doing, that we can then begin to develop resources to spread these behaviors across the field. And when we bring this, when our entire field brings this mindset to our writing and our storytelling, I'm very excited to see what kind of shift is going to result from that.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we're going to give you a few minutes back. My email again in the chat. Look for an email from us in the next week about all of these resources we shared, the recording, and please do keep in touch. We are really looking forward to just taking on this work and also working with you. We know that we have to do this together, and it's actually more fun anyway. So thanks for joining, and we will see you soon.